Still time to head down, Pete, I believe.
Yeah, plenty of time, Rove, and it's funny, every time a woman hops on, Stella seems to jiggle a lot more.
Isn't that intriguing? Isn't that intriguing? All right, thanks very much, Pete. We'll cross back later to see who wins the prize for staying on Stella the longest. But let's meet our next guest, shall we? He has been renowned for some of the funniest moments on TV and cinema, from Monty Python, Fawlty Towers and A Fish Called Wanda. But now with the James Bond series and Harry Potter movies, he is part of the Melbourne International Comedy Festival beginning Thursday, which he has involvement with the Travel World people. He's one of the best known and most loved comedians in the world. Ladies and gentlemen, John Cleese. John, thank you very much for joining us.
A pleasure.
And how are you doing? What have you been up to as of late?
Well, I still have to earn a bit of money because I bought a beautiful little ranch near Santa Barbara, which is way north of Los Angeles, well out of the orbit of Los Angeles.
Now, with all due respect, I wouldn't see you as a ranch kind of guy.
No, neither would I, because, you know, I was born into a good, respectable, what did we used to say? Poor but honest, the worst possible combination, family. And, you know, we used to have a back garden that was probably about the size of this studio. And suddenly, my wife suggested to me, she's from Texas, a few years ago, about 4 years ago, that we should buy this place that was on the market very, very cheap. And it's only 15 acres, which is tiny compared with most American ranches. But it's just beautiful. Half of it is hillside, but my wife and daughter are both obsessed with horses. And we've got wonderful alpacas and 25 chickens and an aviary. It's just a wonderful, silly, peaceful place, and I just love it.
Now, also here in Australia, we've seen you lately as part of the Travel World ad campaign, which is also coinciding. They are sponsors for the Melbourne International Comedy Festival, which begins this week. So what's your association with Travel World?
Well, they sent me a couple of very funny scripts and said, would you like to make these? I said, great, because I used to do a lot of commercials for Australia, and then I'm afraid the bottom fell out of your economy, and I didn't get any offers for a few years. So that was fun, and they're very nice people, and I was delighted when they explained to me. I mean, they help with all the travel arrangements for the festival, and it's such a huge festival now. They tell me that it's one of the 3 greatest comedy festivals in the world. There's
Montreal and Edinburgh.
Yeah, and there's a nice one at Aspen, but it's nothing like the size of yours. So they do all the travel for that, and that's a lot of travel. And also the Raw Talent Competition, for which I gather there's 650 entries this year, which is fantastic.
Yeah, and it's a great breeding ground for young talent, the Raw Comedy Contest.
Wonderful.
Was there anything around when you were starting out that was like that was good for launching young talent?
I don't think there was. You see, the big change came, I would have said, probably at the end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, when you started to get a lot of stand-up acts. Now, in my day, probably because theatre was still the kind of dominant paradigm in entertainment, most of the stuff we did was sketches, like you got Monty Python, just 2 or 3 people, and usually there was a group of them, you know, 6 or 7 or something like that, doing almost exactly what Python did, even if it was a bit more conventional, on stage. And that's what got onto television in the late 50s, early 60s. And then as the 60s and 70s worked their way through all those sketch shows, then all of a sudden, television in England certainly discovered that putting individual stand-up comics on was a very cheap way of making people laugh. And then people with good comic visions got drawn to this because as individuals they were kind of able to put across a world view in a way you couldn't quite do if you were members of a group. So I think it grew out of that transition in something like the late 70s, early 80s.
Do you still go out to see much comedy?
No, not very much anymore. One of the problems about getting old in comedy is that you kind of know most of the jokes. You know, in the first 20 years, when you start, you're about 20, and you start and you're learning. But the fact is, I sometimes feel there's almost a finite number of jokes in the world. And of course, once you've heard a joke, it's quite hard to laugh at it a second time. It's possible if you've sort of forgotten it. I still sometimes laugh if I see some of my old stuff, but only if I've forgotten it, you know?
Well, speaking of your stuff, Monty Python, of course, the one thing most people would know, know you for. 25 years on, did you expect that Monty Python would stand the test of time? And do you still remember most of the sketches yourself?
No, well, I don't actually. I was watching in England about 3 years ago. I came in one evening and switched the television on. That was an old Python show, and I started watching it. And then a sketch came up on the screen. I would have bet money that I'd not been in that sketch. I had no recollection of it at all. Well, you see, it's what is it? It was 25 years ago. So, no, I can remember most of the stuff, but when people come up and quote lines at me now, I'm usually pretty hard put to remember what they're talking about.
You, the man who wrote and starred in most of these sketches, you don't remember the lines yourself. When a die-hard fan comes up and knows them all, every single one of them, word for word, how do you react to that? Are you flattered, or do you sometimes think that maybe these people have too much spare time on their hands?
Well, I am genuinely flattered. I mean, any time you've done something that people really like, it makes you feel good. You know, of course it does. At the same time, if they come up and start reeling off their favourite sketches, it doesn't kind of give me much to say, you know what I mean? I much prefer it when people will come up and they make an observation about something, or even ask me a question about something. And then you get a real conversation going between the two of you, which is always fun.
And how are you enjoying your film work nowadays with the Harry Potter and 007 James Bond series?
Well, very differently. I absolutely love the Bond stuff because I like Barbara Broccoli and Michael Wilson, the producers, very much. I get on very, very well with Pierce, who's a delight to work with. He's so easy and accommodating and friendly and full of ideas. Harry Potter is kind of miserable because they've shot it all. And I just appear, you know, because I'm the ghost who has to be fitted on the other scenes. I never get to see any of the other actors. I'm saying all my lines to metal stands with little white crosses on with white plaster, you know, and the director says, will you say that line there? And then when we play you, or no, then there's usually somebody in a sports jacket I've never seen before who's reading all the other actors' lines. And when he reads that line, will you look at that white thing? And then will you look back over there? And then will you turn this? And while you're doing this, you're sitting on a bicycle seat, which is doing all sorts of strange things and moving you around. And when you do the take, you don't know if it's any good, and the director doesn't know it's any good, because it's only the special effects supervisor who knows whether it's going to fit into the other take in the right way, and whether I'm going to be looking at the right people at the right time. So it's a very strange, technical, detached business, and you do, I mean, dozens and dozens and dozens of takes without really knowing whether you're getting better or worse.
And who said Hollywood wasn't glamorous?
Oh, none of filming's glamorous. It's a joke. I often get a laugh about 6 o'clock in the evening by saying, now, who joined the film industry because they thought it was going to be glamorous? You know, it's uncomfortable, boring, and it takes an enormous amount of time.
Well, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us. John Cleese.
Thank you.